name is Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis. These two men are here all the way from the American Civil War in the 1800s. Mr. Lincoln, Mr. Davis, since you've made the long journey through time, I'd like to ask you a few questions. This first one is for both of you. During your presidencies, and especially during the Civil War, what would you say were some of the biggest challenges you've faced?
There were so many challenges during the war that I don't know where to start. One of the greatest was keeping the Union's morale high, especially during the beginning of the war, when things were looking grim for the United States. I did the best I could by making speeches such as the Gettysburg Address and publishing writings. Another difficulty was finding the right lieutenant general to lead the army. I went through multiple men until I found the one who would fight the war the way I wanted it fought, Ulysses S. Grant.
And you, Mr. Davis?
That's an interesting question. I had many difficulties, as you may know, leading up to the South's loss in 1865. I had disagreements with the Confederacy's Congress, and my economic policies failed. But my greatest challenge was most likely the fact that the Union was better equipped for the war than the Confederacy. After the battle at Fort Sumter, Abe here.
My name is Abraham.
Sorry. Abraham recruited 75,000 soldiers for the Union Army. I also recruited some, but not nearly that many. Also, after the Emancipation Proclamation, slaves no longer supplied us with food, so that really affected our strength. The North manufactured the vast majority of the U.S.'s firearms. Some people in the Confederacy were loyal to the Union, and the Union had a strong naval force. All these disadvantages made it very hard for me to win the war.
Thank you, gentlemen. The next question is just for Mr. Lincoln. Mr. President, why did you issue the Emancipation Proclamation?
The main reason that I gave the Emancipation Proclamation is that it helped the Union. Most of my actions I did because I thought they particularly helped the Union. I would not have made the proclamation if it would not have helped the United States stay united. I emancipated the slaves because, as I said before, a house divided cannot stand.
Very interesting, Mr. President. Mr. Davis, might I ask you why you were so reluctant to take the presidency of the Confederacy?
I knew it was a position of great power, but I really wanted a job in the military. I was hoping for a post as Secretary of War or a high-ranking general, like I was under President Franklin Pierce, or the head of the Army, as I had much military experience. Though I was president, I acted as my own Secretary of War, and tried to help as much as I could with military strategy.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. Now, to both of you, what was your view on slavery?
As I mentioned before, I was against slavery as long as I felt that its abolition would keep our country together. I wanted to do what was best for the nation, and I thought that abolition was in the best interests of the state's unity.
I, being a plantation owner, favored slavery. In my opinion, slaves are property and should not be taken from us. They were very valuable to the South's economy until they were freed.
Evidently, you two have very different views on this subject. But moving on, Mr. Lincoln, how did you cope with sadness in your life?
As is well documented, there was much sadness in my life due to the deaths of some of my sons and the despair I felt for the soldiers who gave their lives in battle. But I managed by telling stories and cracking jokes whenever I felt melancholy. I remember old David Davis used to love my jokes. Here's one. One time I was splitting rails when a man carrying a rifle walked up to me and demanded that I look him directly in the eye. Well, I stopped my work and obliged the man, who continued to silently stare at me for some minutes. Finally, the man told me that he had promised himself years ago that if he ever met a man uglier than himself, he would shoot him. I looked at the man's rifle and said nothing. Finally, I pulled up my shirt, threw out my chest, and exclaimed, "If I'm uglier than you, go ahead and shoot, 'cause I don't want to live."
Thank you for the joke, Mr. President. Mr. Davis, may I ask why you supported secession if you had spoken out against it earlier?
Even though I originally argued against secession, I did decide to speak in its favor during my farewell address. I felt that states, as sovereign powers, had the right to secede from the Union if they decided that their rights were being violated. Mississippi, for instance, decided to secede because the Union intended to remove some of its rights. In this case, I stood firmly behind my home state in its attempt to make right the nation's wrongs.
Thank you, sir. This second to last question is for both of you. Why did you suspend the people's rights to habeas corpus?
The main reason I suspended habeas corpus is that I thought it would help the Union. I wanted to prevent troops from moving around Maryland, since the state legislature was about to meet. I also hoped it would stop rebellions in the South and protect Washington, D.C.
I actually suspended the writ of habeas corpus 7 months before Lincoln did. There was a possibility that some people in the Confederacy were plotting against it, so I put the writ on hold in order to apprehend them. I wanted to use this postponement in places where people were in favor of the Union.
To round off this interview, I'll ask you one more question. What were your thoughts when you knew the war had ended?
Well, I guess I would have been elated, but I was dead, so I really don't know.
I guess you have to read my book to find out. The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, for coming here today. It was such an honor to meet you. Let's give them a big round of applause, everyone.